Hi, and welcome back to another piano lesson, or more correctly, a lesson about piano lessons. Today I'm going to give you some advice on how to form good piano practice habits. These are just based on my own personal experience and teaching quite a few students, and I'm going to try to keep things as practical as possible. Let me start with something that might surprise you. A lot of people think about piano practice a little bit like a Rocky movie. This means that a lot of students feel like they should be really motivated, and when they don't feel motivated, they feel guilty. So the first piece of advice I'd like to give you is you should start out by striking out these two words from your vocabulary. I'm talking about both guilt and, perhaps surprisingly, motivation. Motivation is a great tool for getting something done once. But it's not really a good way of going about doing things on a repeating basis. If you think about most of the things that you do on a daily basis in your life, I would assume that most of them are not driven by motivation. You brush your teeth not because you're motivated, or you cook dinner not because you're motivated to cook dinner. Rather, these things are habits, and habits are governed by a different set of rules. Piano practice is a lot like these things. Having a piano practice routine is really having or forming a habit. So I'd like to start by crossing out both motivation and guilt out of your vocabulary when you think about building up good piano practice habits. Now, the thing about forming habits is it's a positive feedback mechanism, meaning as you start practicing and gain confidence and improve, this creates in turn a growing desire within you to keep on practicing even more. So the main challenge with forming a habit is starting out and doing it for a substantial amount of time, let's say a few weeks or a couple of months. But once you've set the habit in place, it sort of self-sustains, it becomes a second nature. So this leads us to the question, how do you actually form the habit? How do you get yourself to start practicing and do it consistently for a period of, say, 2 or 3 months on a daily basis? Now, the way I view it is trying to form a habit is a battle. It's a fight. And it's a fight between the you of today, who is trying to outsmart the you of tomorrow. Meaning, you know that tomorrow is going to come and you're going to have to sit down at the piano and practice. So how do you actually sort of prime your conditions or make it as easy as possible for you to practice? That's really the question that we're going to focus on for the remainder of this video. Now, the first thing I'd like you to do is try to find a place to put your piano at. Now, I'm talking about piano, but I mean, the advice I give here should be applicable to any instrument. This could be, ideally, if you're like a multimillionaire and you have room for everything, you should have a piano room. Okay, you should have a room that has nothing but a piano, nothing else in it. You can close the door, sit down, and play and practice. But you don't have to dedicate an entire room for this. It could be a corner in a room where you have your piano and you have as few distractions as possible. There are two reasons for doing this. First of all, people tend to associate locations with actions. So, you go into a pub and you immediately associate the notion of a pub with drinking or meeting friends and so on. When you go to work, you sort of enter a work mode. We tend to form habits and tie them to places. This is why, by the way, taking a vacation is a good way of breaking or making habits. Once you remove yourself from your familiar locations to which you've tied your habits, many of the things that you've done before sort of don't happen. But that's a different deal. The second reason for finding sort of a spot to put your piano at and practice is to try and make that location or spot as free from distractions as possible. So if you can, try to put the piano in a room or a corner far away from a TV, say, or, if you have a PlayStation, try to make sure that the PlayStation is in the other room. Now, the next thing that you should do is you should identify the particular spot during the day where it's easiest for you to practice. It's extremely important that you build up your practice habits at a particular time during the day, and preferably after or before some other action that you do on a daily basis. Now, this might be a bit tricky. What you need to do is you need to sit down and really sort of observe your day. And you'd be surprised how many things we do during the day that we take for granted or sort of almost don't pay attention to. And I highly recommend that you for a day or two, just be aware of the things that you do throughout the day and the order in which you do them. And it might even help to just write them down on a piece of paper. It might seem a little bit stupid, but it goes a long way in helping you identify that, that right point in time for you to sort of insert your piano practices. For example, let's say that you get up in the morning, you brush your teeth, you have your coffee, and then you go out to work. And you do this consistently every morning. Every morning is the same. So in that case, what might be useful or might be a good place to sort of squeeze in your practice routine is after you've had your morning coffee and before you go to work. Now, this might mean that you'd have to get up 10 minutes earlier or half an hour earlier, and you might or might not be able to do this, which is fine. You just need to identify the particular sequence of events after which or before which it's easiest to practice. Another example. Let's say you go to bed every day at 11 p.m. And before you go to bed, you brush your teeth, you take a shower, and you have like an evening cup of tea. And this happens at the same order every day. Now, what you might do is after you brush your teeth and take your shower, you could say, okay, I'm going to put my 15 minutes of practice every day right here before I drink my nightly cup of tea. The guiding principle is always make it as easy as possible. Identify a repeating and routine point in time throughout the day where you can take these 10, 15, 20 minutes and sit down and practice. Now, you might notice that I'm saying 10 minutes or 15 minutes and I'm not saying 2 hours. And the reason for this is that when you start building a habit, it really does not matter how long you practice for. And in fact, what you really want to do is practice as little as possible. And this is pretty counterintuitive because people think, well, I should just practice as hard as I can. I mean, all those concert pianists, they sit down and they practice 4 hours a day. How am I going to get anything done by practicing 10 minutes a day? But you see, when you start out, when you're trying to form the habit, your goal is not to actually practice piano. Your goal initially, in the first couple of months or couple of weeks, depending on your psychology, your goal is to simply form the habit itself. Once the habit is formed, don't worry. The extra practice will happen almost naturally on its own. But when you're building the habit, you want to make it as easy and effortless as possible for you to sit down and actually practice. And this means that even if you practice 5 minutes a day, that's actually a good start. If you keep it up, if you practice for 5 minutes a day for 2 months, every day, then I assure you that you'll have formed a habit and that then over time, the amount of time you practice will actually increase way beyond 5 minutes a day. This ties into a broader concept, which is that on the one hand, you should make practice as easy as possible and reward yourself for doing it. And on the other hand, you should try to penalize yourself or make it uncomfortable on some level for yourself not to practice on a daily basis. Again, remember, the issue here is not the amount of time you practice, but the actual practice itself, actually sitting down every day and practicing, even if it's for 5 minutes a day. Now, my remaining pieces of advice are really all about these two things, namely making it an easy or positive experience for you to practice and making it a hard or negative experience for you not to practice. For example, you should reward yourself for a successfully completed practice session. This could be anything that you like doing. It can be maybe a glass of wine. I don't want to create any alcoholics out there, but maybe. It could be maybe an episode in a series that you like watching. Or maybe if you like watching YouTube videos like this one, but you feel like you've been spending too much time on YouTube lately, then you could strike a deal with yourself. You could say, every time I finish my practice session, I can sit down for 15 minutes and watch YouTube videos. Of course, at least 10 of these should be Mangle project videos, but I digress. Another way in which you can make your practice easier is if you have a sort of dedicated digital piano. And I'm saying this because a lot of times people ask me, should I buy like a controller, MIDI controller keyboard, and maybe like computer software and attach them, connect them, and I'll have a great sounding piano sound? Or should I buy a standalone digital piano? And my answer is almost always that if you're trying to learn an instrument, you're much, much better off buying a standalone digital piano. The reason for this is that turning on a MIDI controller keyboard and a piece of software and troubleshooting software issues and waiting for everything to boot up and waiting for the operating system to boot up, and all of these things take time and they sort of wear you out actually on the long run. On the other hand, having a standalone digital piano, even if it's more expensive or not even as nice sounding, it gives you a feeling of immediacy. Just push a button, 5 seconds later, you're already plugged in, you're sitting down, and you're playing. So that's a good example of making practice easier on yourself, sort of lowering the energetic barrier for activating this habit. Another way of making it a positive experience for yourself is to keep a practice journal. So, just keep a small notebook next to the piano that you play on. And every time you finish a practice session, you record it in the notebook. So you write down the date and you write down the number of minutes that you've practiced. And, as time goes on, you see this notebook fill up, and that gives you a sense of accomplishment. It's true that practice leads to improvement in playing, and that in itself is a great sense of accomplishment, but that might take quite a bit of time. If you write your practice sessions down and you write down the minutes, that gives you another sort of accomplishment, one that is almost visual. You can look at the notebook and you can feel, I've done I've completed these many practice sessions. And you can start adding up the numbers and following them, and it's quite a bit of fun doing this. I personally would liken it to following the stock market. You buy a stock and you follow it over time, and it starts growing and growing, and you see it growing, and it just gives you a sense of satisfaction. This is also a good point of emphasizing again how useless guilt is as a tool for creating a sustainable habit. Let's say that for some reason that's not up to you, you miss out on one practice session. Now, if you start feeling guilty about it, then you might start saying to yourself, well, I missed this, I'm not as good as I really want to be. What's the point of this entire practice? I'm never going to be as good as, a classical pianist. And before you know it, you're giving up on your practice routine. This is the kind of damage that guilt causes. Rather, when you miss out on a practice session, don't think about it too much. Just resume practicing the next day. It's really as simple as that. Don't feel any guilt. Don't try to agonize over it. Whatever happened, happened. Over the long term, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you build and sustain your practice habits. And for that to happen, you have to get back on the horse. You have to restart your practicing the next day. So I've mentioned some things that would make it easier or pleasurable for you to practice. Now there's a flip side to this coin, which is you should find ways of making it unpleasant for you not to practice. And I'm not talking about guilt. Guilt is actually, as I've said, one of the useless things when it comes to forming habits. Let me give you some ideas of some things that you can do to make sure that you don't miss out on practice sessions. The simplest thing that you can do is to say or state out loud to yourself what exactly is it that you're going to do. So for example, if you've decided that you're going to sit down and practice every night after your shower for 5 minutes, and you know that you finish showering at around 10:30 p.m., then what you should do is articulate precisely what it is you're going to do, when you're going to do it, and where you're going to do it. So you might tell yourself, and you should do this explicitly and write it down. As silly as it sounds, do it, trust me, this thing works. So you might tell yourself, today I'm going to sit down after my shower at 10:30 p.m. At the piano and practice scales for 5 minutes, and then I'm going to write it down in my practice journal. Now, by articulating what it is you're going to do, you're really increasing the chances dramatically of you doing this. If you write it down on a magnetic sort of board with a dry erase marker, then that's even better. When you get back from work, you're going to see it right there in front of you, and it's going to remind you. And so many things we do sort of on autopilot. So by having something that takes us out of this autopilot, we can help shape the course of our evening or morning or whenever it is that you're going to practice. An even better way of creating an unpleasant sensation for when you're not practicing is finding someone external to yourself for whom you're going to play the pieces that you're working on. Now, this doesn't have to be a musician or an expert or anything. It can be your, girlfriend or boyfriend or wife or husband or whatever. So say every 2 weeks, you sit your girlfriend down and you play for her the piece that you're working on and show her how far you've gotten and how much better you've gotten. Now, this needs to be done in a non-judgmental way. The point here is not to judge you. Her role is not to judge you. Rather, her role in this particular example is to give you an anchor, something that you expect every 2 weeks. And this gives you the motivation and drive to practice because you're going to sit down with this person every 2 weeks and play whatever it is you're working on to them. The best kind of anchor, of course, is a music teacher. And the role of a music teacher, even more than giving you the exercises to work on and correcting your technique and so on, is to really function as this sort of anchor, this person with whom you meet every week, and you sit down and you play your progress and you show how much you've progressed and what you've been doing. And this is a really powerful way of making you practice. This is also why playing in a band is very useful. You're going to get on stage or in a practice room, in a rehearsal with other musicians, and you really want to do your best. And for you to do your best, of course, you have to practice. So it's a great motivational tool. Not a negative one that's supposed to make you feel guilty when you don't practice, but rather a positive one where you can show off the fruits of your progress. Now, some people benefit, some, not all, and actually I think not a large percentage, but some people do benefit from asking, let's say, their significant other or family member or a good friend to sit down on a weekly basis and see that you're improving, that you're making progress. And that if you're not making progress, you'll have some sort of price to pay. So this could be something as simple as money. You give them $100 at the beginning of the month, and you sit down with them and you tell them, if you see I'm not practicing, if every day I don't practice, deduct $10 from the amount I've given you, and then at the end of the month, give me whatever's left. That's a somewhat crude way of approaching it, but you get the idea, I assume. Everyone has something that they don't want to give up and that can be used as leverage against them, including you. And who knows you better than you know yourself? So you can really push those buttons where they hurt. But so that's not my favorite way of doing things. It can be effective, but I don't think it's a good long-term way of building habits. As I've said, during the beginning, everything's fair game. And if you think this sort of external price to pay would work in your benefit, then go for it. As I've said, the more you practice and the stronger your habit becomes, the less you're going to need these sort of cheap tricks. Now with this, I think we've come to the end of this sort of meta lesson, or meta piano lesson, which really wasn't about playing piano, but it was about learning to play piano, and more concretely about forming the habit of practicing. And I hope I've given you some very practical ideas and tips for really building up good practice habits. And of course, you can apply this to any other instrument that you want to learn, or actually anything you want to learn. So remember, you're trying to form a habit, so stop thinking in terms of motivation or guilt or any of these things. Think of this as a very routine, mechanistic thing. And you're trying to get yourself to sit down and practice for a small amount of time every day for, let's say, 2 months. If you can do this, then you've won. I assure you that if you sit down every day for 2 months and practice for 5 minutes, then it's really only a matter of time before this practice becomes 10 minutes and 15 and 20 minutes and so on, and you see meaningful results to your practice. That's it. I hope you've learned something interesting, and I'll see you next time.